A History of the World according to David Rovics. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Mark Twain. Sometimes I wake up one morning with a project in mind, and this project began just like that. Over the years, I've put songs and prose together in various forms for the purposes of popular education, but until now I've avoided putting together the kind of grand sweep that this project represents. If there was a single inspiration for embarking on this project, it was my January 2024 album documenting the Gaza genocide, Notes from a Holocaust, being deleted from my discography on Spotify after it had been up there for the better part of a year with no explanation or even notification that it had happened. These are terrifying times for so many reasons. One of those being the ever-increasing control over our means of communication by massive tech corporations and their handlers from the FBI and whatever other agencies. Which of my albums will be deleted next? On which platform will I next have basic functions disabled or more content deleted? At what point might my career be effectively shadow banned or more overtly blacklisted out of existence by these hegemonic entities? Whether I'm slated to be effectively disappeared from the corporate internet in the near future or not, this and various other concurrent existential crises compel me to take a step back from all the chaos that I apparently have no control over and take stock of history. Salient moments in the history of the past few centuries of human civilizations, and my efforts to make sense of them. I've spent a lot of the past 3 decades or so traveling and discovering obscure bits of history from various parts of the world that way, as well as reading a fair number of books about history and consuming far too much media along the way. I've had time, amid these activities, to eventually start to see some patterns in terms of why things happen in the world and some of the factors that motivate people to behave in one way or another, depending on the reality they're living with. Culling from the many hundreds of songs about historical events I've written over the decades, I've selected around 170 of them to help me spin this tale here. For the latter years explored in these recordings, the songs began as commentary on current events and became historical later, as it all does. As I try to contextualize all of these stories within the broader arcs of history as it has played out, in the broader arc of the struggle between the haves and the have-nots, between the invaders and the invaded, or in the development of social movements, I hope that what listeners are left with represents some useful connecting of some of the dots that need to be connected in your own efforts to make sense of this big mess that we've all been born into. In light of my ever scarier experiences with being censored and blacklisted on various platforms, let me be completely clear that all of my music and all of these recordings are Creative Commons and should be shared freely, privately, or publicly anywhere. As long as I have a website, you should be able to find all of these recordings at davidrovics.com/history. And now, a history of the world according to David Rovics. 1492. We'll start there, and the timeline will tighten up a lot as we go forward. As most anyone from the Americas knows, 1492 was a big year, when a guy who, it turns out, was probably a Spanish Jew who folks in the U.S. call Christopher Columbus, led an expedition and a slaughter of Arawak people that would set the stage for centuries of colonization of the entirety of the Americas and all of the conflicts and contradictions that were inherent to this process. There's no doubt that this imperial expedition frames so much of the history that unfolded afterwards. This is something everyone can agree on, regardless of whether they're fans of Columbus, or imperialism, or genocide, or not. But another expedition involving many more ships than those under Columbus's command also took place in 1492, which would also be a seminal event that would frame so much of the next several centuries in so many ways, despite the event having been nearly wiped off the historical record, as far as it being something anyone from the Western world might learn in school or on TV. Following the unification of Spain under the Catholic monarchy of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, Jews were given 3 months to either become Christians or leave Spain. The new monarchy's Alhambra decree, condemning the Jews of Spain to conversion, expulsion, or death, is a historical episode I first heard about a long time ago, along with many other people interested in history. What took many decades longer to eventually read about is what happened after the mass expulsion plans were announced. What happened next is so crucially important because it flips on its head centuries of anti-Muslim, anti-Ottoman, pro-Christian, pro-European propaganda. The reality for Jews and so many other religious or ethnic minorities in Europe over the past 1,000 years has involved a violent early death for millions of people, killed in crusades, inquisitions, pogroms, or gas chambers. The reality for such minority groups during most of that time in the vast parts of the world ruled by the Ottoman Empire was, especially by comparison, one of peace, prosperity, and mutual acceptance. The expedition embarked upon by the Ottoman Navy under the leadership of Sultan Bayezid II epitomized the stark contrast between the intolerance of the European Christian zealots of the time and the multiculturalism that was inherent to Ottoman society. The Sultan declared that these new monarchs of Spain were crazy to be impoverishing their own society by expelling so many productive members of it as they were, and that the Ottoman Empire would be happy to welcome them as neighbors. He sent the entire Ottoman fleet west across the Mediterranean to rescue as many as 800,000 Sephardim, or Spanish Jews.
In 1492, Colombo crossed the ocean, only one of many harbors that would then be set in motion. As his men cut limbs of Arawaks and burned children at the stake, plundering a continent for God's sake. In 1492, when King Ferdinand won Granada, he passed a law known as the Edict of Alhambra. It was as the landlords wanted, as his gracious God had willed, that any Jew in Spain had 3 months to leave or else be killed. 800,000 Europeans became refugees and headed east across the Mediterranean Sea. In 1492, they were starving and bereft. The king said they'd be safe up until the time they left. But Christian Europeans cut them open with their swords, searched their stomachs for gold, and dumped them overboard. 800,000 Europeans became refugees and headed east across the Mediterranean Sea. In 1492, the Sultan sent his fleet to go rescue Sephardim after the Ottoman defeat. Hundreds of thousands of people who knew their deaths were near were rescued by Muslims and taken to Izmir. In 1492, the Sultan said that's fine if they'd impoverish their kingdom just to enrich mine. The Sultan also passed an edict. He said, welcome home. Now treat your new neighbors as if they were your own. And 800,000 Europeans became refugees and headed east across the Mediterranean Sea. And headed east across the Mediterranean Sea. In 1492.
In the early days of capitalism, there were no unions, contracts agreed to as a result of collective bargaining, or rules that generally might apply to labor actions such as strikes. There were, however, most definitely bosses and workers, including many bosses profiting tremendously from the terrible exploitation and abuse of workers. Perhaps nowhere was this relationship more stark than it was with the companies making some people spectacularly wealthy in the process of carrying out transatlantic trade, while the seafaring peoples making the voyages and keeping the ships moving around the world often lived with permanent physical disfigurement as a consequence of being beaten with horrific cruelty by sadistic ship captains. During the 17-year-long war between Britain, France, and Spain, known as the 17 Years' War, British transatlantic trade continued to expand. Immediately following the end of this war came the rise of the pirates and the period known later as the Golden Age of piracy. The pirates of the day represented a militant sea-spanning uprising so popular and powerful that during the 6 years before the British Crown embarked on a campaign of mass hangings to break the back of this movement, British transatlantic trade stopped its upward trajectory and leveled out. This was because the crews of so many ships were leading mutinies and boarding other ships to help start more mutinies. They were as disgruntled as they were often disfigured, and the extent of the pirate rebellion prompted even religious leaders like Cotton Mather to criticize the bad treatment of the seamen by their employers. You can learn lots more about the pirate movement of this period in Professor Marcus Rediker's book, Villains of All Nations.
This is a song about a very militant social movement that had its golden age in the beginning of the 17th century. All you sailors near and far, you honest men know who you are. All of you who dare be free, combine with us upon the sea. Together we will drink a toast, ride the wind on down the coast, see the merchant shipped aboard, raise a jar and swing a sword, watch to see the merchant captain crying when they see the black flag flying. The war with Spain is over now, no more Jack over the bow. We fight for no one but our class, we're gonna kick some captain's ass. All you who'd live before you die, come give an honest life a try. Sail beneath the skull and bones, pay no heed to crowns and thrones. No more greedy princes lying when you come sail with a black flag flying. No more whips and no more chains, to live free or die is what remains. If life is too short either way, you might as well live free today. All for one and one for all, we'll board the ship and make the call. Join us, all you good men, and have your liberty again. Watch the crew now leave their captain frying as they come sail with the black flag flying. Here's to Flying Roberts, brave and true, and Mary Kelly's gallant crew. Seems to me the world is ours, Watch as the mighty Navy cowers. We have no nation but the sea, no creed but that we will live free. Loot and burn all that we can, that's run by a dishonest man. Their end is near, there is no denying, when they see the black flag flying. If I could predict the future, then I would. But all I know is this is good. 1720 is the year. There is nothing left to fear. We may live or we may die, perhaps our destiny is nigh. I don't know what the end may hold, but I know these ships are filled with gold that was stolen from the poor as we lay dying. So let us sail with a black flag flying.
The American Revolution was a fight that people participated in for different reasons. Many people had become convinced that this was a struggle against monarchy, for democracy, and for a different kind of more egalitarian participatory society. The writings of Thomas Paine were used to encourage these ideas within the population. Once the revolution was finally victorious and the British forces had retreated, however, the big landowners continued to be big landowners, and the tenant farmers continued to be tenant farmers. The name of the country and the names of the rich white men running things had changed, but class relations remained the same, whether Massachusetts was a British colony or part of the new United States. So the tenant farmers of western Massachusetts rebelled. The courts were evicting farmers for not paying their rent while they were away fighting in the Continental Army. They picked one of the higher-ranking former officers of the Continental Army to be their ostensible leader, and they proceeded to shut down the courts and stop the evictions. The rebel farmers controlled western Massachusetts for years. Although they did not win land reform or an end to the feudal institution of tenant farming, Shays' Rebellion is widely considered to be a key factor in the passage of the Bill of Rights. I grew up not far away from where Shays' Rebellion went down, and spent a lot of time as a kid in western Massachusetts, driving down Daniel Shays Highway and stumbling upon the small monument to the rebellion that can be found in a cornfield along the Appalachian Trail in the Great Barrington area today. I don't remember where I first heard of Shays' Rebellion, but Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States is a book I would most highly recommend for an introduction to that story and so many others.
I was raised in Massachusetts on the farm where I was born. Ever since I was a young lad, to the fields I was sworn. Before our corn could go to market, it was stolen from the mill and sent to Mother England from here in the Berkshire Hills. So when I heard there'd be a rising, I put on a uniform, slept barefoot in the mud beneath thunderstorms. In war there is no glory, just friends and comrades killed, shattered lives and broken homes here in the Berkshire Hills. In the Continental Army, the years dragged on and on. With the French, we fought the Redcoats, so many people dead and gone. Ticonderoga, they surrendered. We had won this test of wills, and those of us left alive came back here to the Berkshire Hills. Then began the nightmare all over once again. Revolutions, debtors' prisons filled with good, upstanding men. We said to hell with King John Adams. Of this farce we'd had our fill. and we set our sights on liberty here in the Berkshire Hills. Their courts, they couldn't function, their judges on the run. Each new day we had our farms was a victory we'd won. For years we kept our land, held our ground until we made our last stand by Great Barrington here in the Berkshire Hills. My name is Danielle Shays, and I'm speaking to you now. If I fought a revolution, maybe you can tell me how. I was born a poor man, and I'm a poor man still. Bury me beneath the hemlock here in the Berkshire Hills.
Barely 30 years after the American Revolution, according to the more mainstream American history books, the nascent United States and the British Empire were once again at war. The British, say the history books, wanted to retake their colonies, and so they were laying siege to Washington, D.C. In reality, however, the British Navy attack on Washington, D.C. via the Potomac River was intended to punish the leaders of the U.S. and give them reason to reconsider the wisdom of attacking other parts of the world still under British control, such as Canada. In 1812, the U.S. sent a military expedition to the city of York, now Toronto, which was then the capital of Canada. Their plan, which they carried out, was to burn the city to the ground, both government buildings and civilian homes. The justification for this U.S. invasion of Canada was the same one the U.S. had the year before when it invaded Florida, then nominally under Spanish rule, that being the need to severely punish any country that dared to interfere with the biggest business in the USA back then, slavery. Enslaved people from the U.S. were making their way to Canada, where the depraved practice of enslaving other human beings was against the law. Fortunately, despite the U.S. attack, Canada continued to welcome escaped slaves. For burning York to the ground, the British Navy, under the command of General Robert Ross, laid waste not only to the White House, but to the Supreme Court and the Congress as well. It was a great day for the construction industry, but not such a great day for the members of Congress, the justices, or the president and his staff, who apparently fled the White House while their breakfast was still hot. According to lore, the British soldiers ate it before they burned down the building. In the course of the American Revolution a few decades earlier, the government of France had bankrupted itself. The immense support they had provided to the cause had been instrumental in defeating the British then, but France was not available by the time of what became known as the War of 1812 to help out again. I only first really heard about this whole debacle when I started playing a lot in Canada. I think I visited the grave of General Ross in Halifax twice. Later, on a visit to Rostrevor in Ireland, I learned that this man so celebrated in Canada actually grew up in Ireland on land his family had participated in stealing from the local inhabitants. In Canada, people may think kindly of him, but not in Rostrevor. Fittingly enough, only weeks after burning down the White House, the Congress, and the Supreme Court, General Ross was shot and killed by Irishmen in Baltimore.
Robert Ross was from Rostrevor. He was born in County Down. His family was given land there by the British Crown. He was a man born of the gentry, born with wealth and fame, but he joined the British Army to serve his queen and make his name. In the Napoleonic Wars, he fought in many lands, in Holland and in Spain, in the far-off Egyptian sands. He was wounded there in battle, came back to fight another day, and he was sent off to attack the USA. York had been sacked and burned by invading Yankee men, but the Canadians regrouped, chased the Yankees home, and then the British Navy made its way to the shores of D.C. town, where General Ross burned the White House down. The year was 1814, the U.S. was in retreat. It was a Canadian victory, an American defeat. Without the French to help them, they got their ass whipped by the Crown when General Ross burned the White House down. The place had just been constructed only 12 years before, but it had to be rebuilt soon after this disastrous war. The president turned tail and ran like a raggedy clown when General Ross burned the White House down. He was killed a few months later. Irish rebels stopped him in his tracks. He was buried in Nova Scotia, in the town of Halifax. He might have been forgotten, but he'll forever be renowned. He's the man who burned the White House down. He's the man who burned the White House down.
The last armed uprising to take place in Great Britain itself took place in 1831. This fact is particularly notable when you consider that it was 3 years later that the trade union councils of England, Scotland, and Wales were formed. By 1834, in Great Britain and some other parts of the world, labor unions were legal, at least on paper, and the idea of forming a union, engaging in collective bargaining, and workers withholding their labor in an effort to win better wages and working conditions were becoming popular and widely practiced tactics. In 1831, this was much less the case. When the miners in and around Merthyr Tydfil, Wales, were told that their already impossibly low wages were about to be drastically cut, they and the rest of the community rebelled. The troops who were in town to do what the mine owners and other rich people would call maintaining order were forced to barricade themselves in their barracks while the miners controlled the area. In a very classic colonial move, the British Crown sent Scottish troops from the Scottish Highlands to put down the rebellion.
1831, the age of industry begun. For the working folk of Wales, life was short. With wages cut again, it was only sensible that then folks took over, shut down the debtors' court. The gentry pulled the wire, told their men to open fire and restore the rule of their estate. But as the night descended and the battle ended, the soldiers had all fled behind a gate. They chanted cheese and bread, and our children must be fed in the days when Wales rose against the crown. They chanted cheese and bread with a bloody loaf above their heads when the red flag flew in Merthyr town. The message went out east and west to put the gentry to the test. The cavalry was ambushed and turned back. After so long playing defense, the time had come now when the workers were the ones on the attack. They chanted cheese and bread, and our children must be fed in the days when Wales rose against the crown. They chanted cheese and bread with a bloody loaf above their heads when the red flag flew in Merthyr town. The Crown sent soldiers by the score till order was restored.
Then came Dick Penderyn's execution, another martyr for the cause, meant to give us pause the next time people call for revolution. They chanted cheese and bread, and our children must be fed in the days when Wales rose against the crown. They chanted cheese and bread with a bloody loaf above their heads when the red flag flew in Merthyr Town.
In a part of the south coast of England where today some fairly posh, picturesque villages may be found, back in the 1830s the farm workers were mostly living harsh, short lives of poverty and want. Forming a union was legal by 1834, but only in theory. In practice, not so much. When 6 farm workers in Tolpuddle, in Dorset County, made a sacred oath to each other to work together to form a union for themselves and other farm workers, the fact that they had made this oath became known. Although forming a union was allegedly legal at this point, making a secret oath wasn't, and so the Crown prosecuted them, and the judge sentenced them to transportation, to be exiled and made to work essentially as slaves, breaking rocks under the searing sun in Australia, or similarly arduous tasks. Tremendous numbers of those sentenced to transportation died before their sentences of hard labor ended. If they survived, they might then have the prospect of making a life for themselves there on the other side of the world, so far from home, in a land they never intended to travel to. In the case of the Tolpuddle martyrs, as these farm workers became known, their time in Australia was relatively short. Only 2 years after they had been sent away, the campaign across England, Scotland, and Wales involving thousands of people demanding justice was successful, and the men were able to come back home to England at the Crown's expense. For many years now there has been an annual festival that takes place in the little village of Tolpuddle to remember the successful campaign to bring the Tolpuddle martyrs back home, and for labor organizers, artists, and other people to get together and keep trying to build the kind of far more egalitarian society that those farm workers in 1834 hoped to someday see.
On the south coast of England in 1834, there was a trial that pitted the rich against the poor. On one side were the landlords with the private army, on the other side were farmhands, their hungry families. To combine was not illegal, but secret oaths were punishable by torturing so cruel it's unimaginable. Transportation, 7 years a slave, a sentence that ended so many early graves. From the south coast of England in 1834, to imagine the privations of the trip that lay in store. 111 days locked up in the hold, fed on bread and water as the southern ocean rolled, and splitting rocks in Sydney beneath the blazing sun, finding out the hard way just how the West was won. All because they dared to try to stand up for their lives, to form a union, feed their children and survive. From the south coast of England in 1834, word spread up to Sheffield and every other shore. Thousands marched to London, people organized all over, from Manchester to Merthyr, from Dundee down to Dover. Help came in from everywhere, the families were supported, the movement won a pardon to bring back the deported. And in 1836, most of them returned, one more battle in the class war about which we never learned. On the south coast of England.
All over the state of New South Wales in Australia, you will find statues in honor of and places named after the state's first governor, a Scotsman named Lachlan Macquarie. Australia's propaganda machine has sought to portray Macquarie as a beneficent ruler responsible for improving the lives of many Australians. There's a far darker side to Macquarie, and what he and others in power across Australia and other colonized lands were doing at that time, however, actively disenfranchising and often killing the indigenous inhabitants of the land now being governed by Europeans or their descendants. There are many clear indications that maintaining the narrative about Governor Macquarie as a progressive icon is of great importance to the powers that be in Australia still today. One of them is the fact that the act of taping a piece of paper with a Lachlan Macquarie quote on a statue of Lachlan Macquarie can get you banned from the central business district of Sydney, fined, and potentially imprisoned.
Lachlan Macquarie was a Scotsman who signed up to serve the British Crown. He traveled around the world to America. Not long after that, he headed down to his post in New South Wales to be the governor, to expand colonial rule. Half of Sydney was named after him. Everybody learns his name in school. Just don't put Macquarie's words beneath his statue. If you do, his defenders might arrest you. Lachlan Macquarie was a governor who opened schools and hospitals. His aim was to civilize a nation in the interests of himself and capital. He was a raging alcoholic and a bad businessman, but you could say he did his best to broaden the global dominion of a project they call the Christian West. Just don't put Macquarie's words beneath his statue. If you do, his defenders might arrest you. Lachlan Macquarie stole children from their parents and never gave them back. And when Gundagara and Darawal people resisted, he ordered his soldiers to attack. He said, make the Aborigines your prisoners, shoot them and hang them from the trees, so as to strike fear in the surviving natives in order to bring them to their knees. Just don't put Macquarie's words beneath his statue. If you do, his defenders might arrest you. Just don't put Macquarie's words beneath his statue. If you do, his defenders might arrest you.
In the 1830s, and then again in the 1860s, military forces of the United Kingdom, as well as a collection of other collaborating armies from the Western world, attacked cities in China, destroying them and ultimately killing tens of thousands of Chinese people. The initial assault by the Western armies was in response to the Chinese authorities setting alight a massive shipment of opium made from poppies grown in India, then under British rule. Opium, like heroin, is an addictive drug. There was a big demand for porcelain and other Chinese products in Great Britain, but there were not many British products that were in demand in China. The British Crown sought to change that situation by forcing China to import opium, which was explicitly against the wishes of the Chinese authorities. In the course of the Opium Wars, which British leaders called a trade war, Chinese rulers relented and allowed the import of this addictive substance, which proceeded to ravage Chinese society for decades. There are a couple of crucial points I would take away from this sordid chapter in the history of British and French, American, Russian, etc. imperialism. One is to note that getting colonized people and other subjects addicted to drugs and alcohol is a long-standing strategy for controlling populations, while also creating a demand for a very profitable product. Another is that this strategy of forcing a product on a country that doesn't want it in order for the imperial powers to have the upper hand in any trade relationship is a long-standing one that has been practiced regularly and all over the world. The way the British Empire got India to start importing British textiles was by first going in and physically destroying India's textile industry. The reality of the era of capitalism has made it abundantly clear that what the capitalists refer to as free trade is only desirable when it's beneficial to the great powers. When it is instead more beneficial to the poorer nations, it is suddenly no longer a good thing, and it's time for another trade war.
Let me tell you a tale, stir a hornet's nest, well remembered in the East, most forgotten in the West. It was the 1830s, and the Industrial Revolution was turning Europe into a land of wage slaves and air pollution. The history books tell us it was the era of free trade, and the entire world hungered for the products Europe made. Merchants plied their wares across the 7 seas, and they brought back things like porcelain, silk, and tea. Soon all the tea in China could barely keep the West awake. Such a thirst for Chinese products as could barely be slaked. They liked to drink their tea in cups of Chinese porcelain, and those who could afford it loved the silk upon their skin. But what made the merchants and the monarchs scream and cry and shout? They seemed to have little to offer that China could live without. They didn't want their muskets and they didn't want their wool, which left the British coffers empty and the Chinese coffers full. And they called it a trade war. They called it a trade war, and I guess that could be so. They say it's not free trade if it's just a one-way flow, because apparently free trade is when the West comes out ahead. That's how it is in practice, though that's never what is said. The fact of history they'd have a sweep under the rug. The one thing they could sell in China was an addictive drug. It had long been banned by Chinese law, but the British didn't care. They packed the opium up in crates and they shipped it there. And they called it a trade war. It all came to a head in 1838. When the soldiers of the emperor torched 20,000 crates. It took 3 days to burn it, and when the fires had gone out, the Chinese people would soon learn what free trade was all about. Navies came from Britain, France, and the USA. In blood, land, and silver they would make the Chinese pay. Cities leveled, thousands killed. The war was 3 years long. That's how they opened China. That's how they got Hong Kong. And they called it a trade war. And they called it a trade war. And they called it a trade war.
The 1840s were a time of revolution and rebellion across Europe, which produced repercussions that spread around the world in so many different ways. This is of note in the context of what became known as the rent strike wars in New York's Hudson Valley, because it may not be a coincidence that the big landlords and the New York authorities decided to give in to key demands of the tenant farmers in the year 1848, 9 years into their struggle. On July 4th, 1839, tenant farmers from the Hudson Valley held a meeting in the village of Berne, where they declared that they would stop paying the rent to the wealthy landowners who demanded 30% of their crops annually in rent. In the case of the massive Van Rensselaer estate, tenant farmers were working land that was originally given to a very wealthy Dutch man back when New York was a Dutch colony. The land had stayed in the hands of the Van Rensselaers under British colonial rule and then after the American Revolution as well, as the family became ever wealthier from nothing more than holding title to great expanses of this fertile river valley. The rent strikers developed strategies to support one another, coming on horseback en masse when they heard a distress call from another farmer echoing through the hills. The rebel farmers wore masks and various elements of animal costumes, speaking in grunts and simplified English, all in the hopes of maintaining their collective anonymity, as time after time they chased away those who had come to exact tribute or repossess the lands of farmers who were refusing to pay the rent. Along with the rent strike party, which for a time had legislators in the New York State Assembly, and the decision of the big landowners to finally sell their lands to the farmers and thus finally end the parasitic relationship the landlords had so long profited from. The rent strike uprising in the Hudson Valley is also considered to be one of the pivotal events that led to the passage of the Homestead Act some years later. As serfs were being freed and various democratic reforms were taking place in the wake of the 1848 rebellions in Europe, the reforms won in the course of the rent strike wars, as well as from the Homestead Act, were to some extent an effort on the part of those in power in the U.S. to rule over a slightly more stable society that was a bit less reminiscent of feudalism. As U.S. society today is more unequal than it has been since the age of the robber barons in the 19th century, however, it's easy to observe the nation's return to a more feudalistic, precarious economic model, once again dominated by massive monopolies and oligarchs.
The patroons came from Holland to America, became landlords where none had been before. Soon one man owned 500,000 acres on both sides of the Hudson River shore. He invited families to move in and give him 30% of everything they grew every year. This is how they pay the rent. His name was Van Rensselaer. He became one of the richest men on earth. In today's terms, $90 billion is how much he'd be worth. All this for doing nothing, but saying all of this was his. I have the power of the state behind me, and I'm in the landlord biz. After 200 years of this and one revolution, one another Van Rensselaer had another son, and this Rensselaer was greedier than his ancestors dead and past. It was the 1840s, and things were changing fast. It was the straw that broke the back. The bottle was uncorked. They started organizing meetings, the tenant farmers of New York. They found the strength of numbers. They found the power of suggestion. They found each other asking the same question. Who gave you the right to be a landlord? To live a life of ease while others toil? Who gave you the right to be a rich man while the rest of us pay you so we can work this soil? They vowed they would stop the rent collection. They vowed they'd bring this madness to an end. And when one blew the tin horn of distress, he soon found he had 1,000 friends. With calico skirts, masks upon their faces, on horseback, armed with knives and guns. They chanted and they yelled, they kept their farms, and they kept the sheriffs on the run. They asked, who gave you the right to be a landlord? To live a life of ease while others toil? Who gave you the right to be a rich man while the rest of us pay you so we can work this soil? The governor's militias tried to stop them, but nothing could be done to break their will. And by 1848 the landlords buckled, sold their holdings to the farmers in the hills. Yes, they overthrew this feudal system, but it's replaced now by speculators and banks. And you can still hear the homeless families asking of all the landed gentry in our ranks, who gave you the right to be a landlord? To live a life of ease while others toil? Who gave you the right to be a rich man while the rest of us pay you so we can work this soil? Who gave you the right to be a landlord? To live a life of ease while others toil? Who gave you the right to be a rich man while the rest of us pay you so we can work this soil? Who gave you the right?
The American propaganda machine, like its counterpart in other settler colonial societies, tries hard to hold on to the narrative that countries like the U.S. or Canada are populated by people who are mostly descended from immigrants who came seeking a better life. There may be some degree of putting on a show about feeling bad about the excesses involving things like the genocide of Indians or the enslavement of Africans, but as far as the majority population is concerned, we are said to be descended from immigrants who came with hopes of striking out into a new world and making something of themselves. We are the descendants of the brave pioneers and all that. The reality is very different. In reality, most of the immigrants to the U.S. and other Anglo-settler colonial countries were European because there was some variety of a whites-only immigration policy in practice. And most of those Europeans who were allowed in were not immigrants seeking a better life, but refugees fleeing war, endemic poverty, political persecution, and or famine. The reality is, if you weren't running an operation that was seeking to profit from exploiting the labor of the colonists and the slaves, you were working for those who were, in one way or another. The essential role the refugee colonists played was to be the shock troops of settler colonial capitalism. The refugee colonists, if they were white and male, were given guns and required to carry them, as they followed the logic of capitalism and went west to homestead, or steal, depending on your vantage point, land from the indigenous population. And if the indigenous people rebelled against this rampant theft of their lands, that obviously is what the guns are for. If we descendants of refugees knew who we were, we might be far less compliant, far less willing to play our parts in the settler colonial program of theft and conquest. If we knew that we were just cogs in a machine of capitalism, along with the rest of society, such as the enslaved millions of Africans, or those who were being excluded from it altogether and banished to reservations where they could starve, such as the American Indians, then we might be far less willing to do the dirty work of the oligarchs, running and profiting from the whole complex capitalist scheme.
My great-grandparents were refugees. That should be a normal thing to say. I was born in New York City. My people came from far away. They fled the generals and dictators, the warlords of Moscow and Budapest. You could be conscripted for the rest of your life, or you could head west. My great-great-grandparents were refugees too, just north and west of Brittany. Farmers in the hills somewhere on the starving side of the Irish Sea. They fled their colonial torturers. They fled starvation, slavery. They fled across the Atlantic along with millions of other refugees. My great-grandparents were refugees, but getting to the other side took such a toll, it seems, that my great-grandfather died. So when his son was a little kid, he grew up without a dad. And that's typical of the hard life so many other refugees had. My great-grandparents were refugees. Let me tell you what that means. They were escaping war-torn lands ruled by tyrants, kings, and queens. They did not come seeking fortune. They were not pioneers. Leaving home, their hearts were broken. All their cries fell on deaf ears. My great-grandparents were refugees. No one taught me that in school. It's dangerous information in the old game of divide and rule. My name is David Rovics, and I know who my people are. They're on that raft upon the ocean. They're in the trunk of that car. My great-grandparents were refugees. That should be a normal thing to say. I was born in New York City. My people came from far away.